Hi everyone, I used to believe that my husband and I had the kind of love that everyone dreams about, the kind that people create stories about and try to imitate. We met young, built a life filled with adventure and laughter, and eventually we had a family. Our son became the life of our home, filling every room with his laughter and the kind of light that only children bring. My husband worked incredibly hard to expand his business so that he could provide us with a good life, and I took care of everything else. It was a straightforward, predictable routine that he worked. I knew he loved me. There was no doubt about it, but I felt the distance between us widening every day as we went through our routines in silence, side by side but not really together the way strangers in a crowded room might be. The house was warm and steady, but routines, even the comforting ones, can eventually start to feel hollow. Somewhere along the way, I started to feel less like a partner and more like a piece of the background. He would come home with that intense, distracted look on his face, his mind obviously still focused on his work. He would work late in his study while I read alone in bed, and sometimes I'd stay up waiting for him to join me. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that this was just how marriage looked after all these years, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was gradually changing into someone he no longer saw, someone who made life comfortable for him, but who could have been anyone. At times, I would stay up waiting for him to join me, and he would eventually, but I could feel his distance when I thought about bringing it up. He was working hard for us, doing his part, and I should be grateful, I thought, but even as I convinced myself of that, something else lingered. A dull ache I couldn't name but couldn't ignore either, and one evening he surprised me by suggesting a trip. But every time I opened my mouth to ask him if he noticed what was happening to us, the words felt too heavy to say. How do you tell someone you're afraid they've stopped seeing you? Though we've been married for years and never had the time for an official vacation, he said he had planned everything down to the hotel and private excursions because he wanted us to reconnect and make up for the years we'd put off our own happiness for the sake of our family. The idea of taking a real vacation, the kind we'd always talked about but never taken, even called it our honeymoon. Over the next few days, I found myself swept up in the excitement of it all and went shopping. It was a cold, gray afternoon, and I was running errands when I stopped by my favorite coffee shop for a quick break. I didn't expect to see my husband there, sitting by the window talking to someone. I thought maybe, just maybe, this trip could be the beginning of something better, and it was the glimmer I needed. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe he was seeing me again, but then something shattered that hope. She was just a figure with dark hair and a graceful demeanor, and at first I didn't recognize her. However, as I watched them, something about her seemed familiar, and I realized with a knot in my stomach that she was an old friend of his from years ago, someone he'd rarely spoken of, but who had once been important to him. They were laughing together, leaning close, as if sharing a private joke, and she reached out and rested her hand on his arm for a moment longer than seemed innocent. I stood there, frozen coffee chilling in my hands. After that afternoon, something changed inside of me, as if my world had shifted just enough to make everything feel unsteady. I spent the evening replaying the moment over and over again, dissecting every glance, smile, and touch of her hand on his arm. I wanted to think there was an innocent explanation, but the more I considered it, the more I felt that ache turned into something more serious. In those few seconds, something cracked inside of me. Not jealousy exactly, but more like dread, an old fear bubbling up to the surface and making my heart race. I wanted to ask him to tell me something that would make everything go away, but I just watched him disappear into his study alone with whatever thoughts kept him distracted these days. I waited, listening to his muffled voice on the phone, probably talking to a client or handling another one of his business matters for a while. Sharper, something closer to betrayal, came home that night late as usual and gave me a tired smile before heading to his study. He didn't mention seeing anyone that day, and he didn't mention her. The following few days, I tried to act normal in order to play the part of the patient, loving wife, but my mind was racing with questions that I was too scared to ask. I began to notice small details that didn't seem to matter, but somehow his phone, which he used to leave lying around the house, was now always in his pocket or face down on the table. His reasons for staying late at work increased, and there was an almost guilty tension in the way he moved around me, as if he was trying to avoid spending too much time staring at me. He was getting ready to leave for a work dinner one evening when I couldn't contain myself any longer. "Are you sure it's a business dinner?" I asked, trying to sound lighthearted, but I could hear the strain in his voice. He paused, looking at me with a hint of confusion. "Of course it is," he said, laughing. "What else could it be?" He looked at me, and then a mixture of amusement and exasperation made my heart sink. It seemed like I was being silly, as if I was making something out of nothing, but I couldn't get the... I wanted him to believe me when I said, "I saw you the other day," and he looked happier and lighter than he ever seemed at home. He stiffened for a brief moment, but it was enough. "Oh, that was just an old friend," he said, "but we ran into each other by chance." She wanted to catch up. I wanted his words to relieve the tension I'd been carrying and return everything to how it had been before, but there was something in his tone that felt too casual. In order to pretend that this was all in my head, I told myself that if I could get through this and push these doubts aside, the trip would fix everything, and we'd have time to reconnect away from all the distractions and away from anyone else who might come between us. However, as he left that night, I couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment that began to gnaw at everything good I tried to hold on to. Days turned into weeks. However, as the days went by, my excitement waned. Every time he spoke about the trip, I could hear the same excitement and eagerness in his voice, but it felt different now. Rather than like he was looking forward to us, it felt like he was running away, using the trip as a way to escape to make up for something he wasn't willing to admit. The night before we left, I found myself awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to find the strength to simply ask him, the thought of him laughing with her, the warmth in his eyes that, when we finally left on our trip, everything felt surreal. He was more attentive than he had been in months, his hand resting on mine as we drove through winding roads and past sweeping views. He seemed to be trying in his own way to make me feel seen again, and for brief moments I could almost believe we were seeing each other again. I had not seen him in such a long time, and it made my heart feel like it was breaking and hardening all at once. I wanted to confront him to demand an answer, but I was afraid of what he might say, fearing that I would lose the last bit of peace I had been holding on to. The days leading up to that evening had felt like the gradual tightening of a rope around my heart. I tried to immerse myself in the beauty surrounding us to pretend that the man holding my hand was still the one I believed in all these years. However, beneath it all, that ache lingered as a constant reminder of what I'd seen. I told myself I'd confront him eventually, maybe not tonight or tomorrow, but soon. He kept finding ways to surprise me, taking me on hikes through secret trails, bringing my favorite treats for a picnic by a stream, even finding the cabin's dusty record player and pulling out old vinyl records that filled the air with songs we once loved. The beautiful views and fresh air had been meant as an escape for us, a place to rekindle what had faded over the years. He was attentive and affectionate in ways he hadn't been in years, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that it was all a... He never mentioned it, but I believe he sensed my distance from him because of the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking and the brief silent pauses he took before reaching out to me as if he were bracing himself. His performance was an attempt to buy back my loyalty without acknowledging the betrayal he'd hidden every time he took my hand, looked at me with those warm, familiar eyes, or tried to pull me closer in bed at night. The night of the dinner, he'd gone all out and set up a private meal at the small restaurant by the cabin, and as we walked in, candlelight spilled from every corner, flickering against the dark wood walls, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and haunting. I wanted him to feel what I had been feeling, the unsteady, nauseating sensation that nothing was as it seemed. Perhaps on some level, I wanted him to feel that uncertainty, to know that something was wrong, even if he couldn't identify it. Led me to a table by the large window overlooking the mountains and a starry sky. Through the speakers, I could hear a delicate guitar strumming, a background that might have warmed my heart in a different life, but tonight it only made the resentment that was already building inside of me stronger. We ordered wine, and I watched him as he talked to the server, noting how he laughed and joked, how he so easily found his charm when it suited him, and when he looked at me, his eyes were... He said softly, "I've missed this." He reached across the table to take my hand, and we continued to be together like this, just the two of us. I looked at his hand holding mine, his thumb lightly grazing my knuckles, but it felt strange, like an intrusion. I couldn't bring myself to respond, couldn't bring myself to give him even the slightest bit of myself. Instead, I slowly withdrew my hand and forced a smile, barely acknowledging the flicker of hurt that crossed his face. We continued in silence, with the clinking of glasses, and I sipped my wine and pretended to listen as he talked about his plans for the next day, including his excitement about hiking up to a remote waterfall he had read about, but my thoughts were miles away, locked in that coffee shop watching him with her. The sound of silverware against plates filled the air around us, and every word felt hollow, as if we were just playing parts we no longer believed in. I could feel myself on the brink of something reckless, something I couldn't control. Take back. Then our server came back with the main course and put the plates down with a quiet grace. He nodded at me, and then I felt a wave of dark resolve sweep over me. The plan that had been brewing in the back of my mind felt within reach, like a challenge I had finally accepted. I looked at him for a second longer than usual, and he nodded subtly enough to show that he understood the knot in my stomach that formed as I watched him move to stand behind my husband's chair, waiting for his turn. Sipping my wine, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread as I anticipated what was going to happen. Then, before I could second-guess myself, the silence broke and the waiter's arm swung forward, clutching my husband's shoulder with such force that his glass fell to the ground. My husband's face whipped around, his features flashing with confusion as he took in the waiter's frown and the way his fingers dug into his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" my husband demanded, but the waiter swung a fist before he could push him away, straight into his jaw, causing him to sprawl backward and tip his chair over with a heavy thumb. My husband struggled to stand up, but the server was unrelenting, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him back down for a brief moment. I froze, watching in a mixture of horror and satisfaction because this was exactly what I wanted, to see him feel helpless, to see him struggle, just as I had struggled with the pain he had caused me. However, as I watched him, blood dripping from his lip and his eyes wide with confusion, I felt He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a sign of support, a signal that I would step in and call for help, do something, but I just stared back at him, my face expressionless, allowing him to see the depths of my resentment. He called out my name, his voice strained and desperate with disbelief, and he managed to choke it out. "What's going on? Why aren't you?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice low so only he could hear. "I saw you with her laughing," touching her as if she were the one who mattered, and my voice trembled as I spoke, the hurt and resentment leaking out faster than I could control. "Do you think I'm stupid? I know about her." I whispered my words sharp as knives, "and your little coffee shop meeting's your old friend." But there was something else there. "Now, fear, what are you talking about?" he stammered, wincing as the server's grip tightened. "Don't lie to me. Know what it's like to see that I've been here faithfully keeping everything together while you go off, Fan. She's just a friend." He gasped and slurred his words as the waiter delivered another vicious blow, but nothing happened. His protests only made me more angry because I had long since convinced myself that his betrayal was real and that he had crossed a line from which we couldn't return, and now, seeing him here bloodied and desperate, I felt a sick sense of satisfaction that he was finally feeling the pain he had caused me. "Do you really think I'd believe that after everything I've witnessed?" He tried to speak and reach for me, but the man joined in, and now he's throwing punches at him, sending him back to the ground. I watched it happen, letting my rage drive me farther than I ever imagined I'd go. I wanted him to be hurt, wanted him to understand the depth of the betrayal I felt, and every impact and groan that came out of his lips felt like a release it twisted. I thought I would feel vindicated, but as I looked at him, something else crept in, a sickening emptiness that settled deep in my chest. Eventually, I raised a hand signaling the men to stop, and they hesitated, looking at me for confirmation. His face was bruised and swollen, with a gash above his brow spilling dark rivulets of blood down his cheek. He tried to pull himself up, reaching for the table to steady himself, but he was too weak. Gave a brief nod, and they let him go, leaving him slumped against the table, barely able to support himself. His eyes met mine, and I was puzzled as to why he whispered, barely more than a rasp for a moment. I wanted him to understand my pain and what it was like to be betrayed, but as I stared at him, now broken and bleeding, I realized that the satisfaction I had been craving was hollow and that the victory I had imagined was only a mirage, so I turned away. The night he lay beaten on the cabin floor, I thought I had reached some twisted form of closure, that when he finally pulled himself together and left, he would finally understand the depth of my pain and the consequences of betrayal. However, instead of making me feel whole again, the weight of what I had done settled over me like a shroud, suffocating and irreversible to the point that it left a mess that neither of us could ever put back together. I watched him leave without saying a word, feeling both triumphant and empty, but as the hours went by and the cabin's silence pressed down on me, my satisfaction vanished and was replaced by a gnawing hollow ache. I kept waiting for him to return, expecting an explosion or a confrontation, anything to justify the anger I'd unleashed, but by morning, I was alone in that beautiful, desolate place, surrounded by the wreckage of what I'd done, and part of me was relieved that he was gone so I wouldn't have to face the broken remnants of our marriage in his bruised face. But as I packed up our belongings, a silent fear descended upon me that was darker than I had previously experienced. It was the nagging realization that I had crossed a line from which we would never be able to return, and when I got home, all I wanted was to ground myself in the one aspect of my life that felt complete, my son. I pulled into the driveway, my heart racing, picturing the warmth of his small arms enveloping me and the way he would gaze at me with that unwavering trust he always had. As the front door swung open, I saw the police cruiser parked by the curb, its lights flashing silently, casting a cold blue glow over our house. I froze, fear weighing heavily on me. My husband was standing there, holding our son close to his chest, his arms wrapped protectively around him. I could see the cuts above his brow, which were fresh and harsh, and the bruises on his face, which were stark against his pale skin. Our son's face was buried against his shoulder, his little hands gripping his father's shirt in a desperate manner. My heart fell, and I took a shaky breath, reaching out to my husband, who was wearing a mask of cold fury, his eyes narrowed with disgust, and I whispered, trying to force a smile as I stepped forward, hoping that somehow this would all fall apart and that my son would come running to me so I could pretend nothing had happened. However, instead of coming to me, he only tightened his hold on his father, pressing his little body against him as if I were a stranger. "What did you think was going to happen?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with contempt. "Did you really think you could do something like that and just walk away?" My stomach churned as I tried to find the right words to respond to the realization that I had destroyed any last shred of trust or love he'd held for me. I had never seen him look at me as if he could barely stand it, as if the love we'd shared had evaporated, leaving only a seething, simmering hatred in its place. That might explain the chaos I'd unleashed, but before I could say anything, 2 officers came. Their faces were unreadable as they reached out to grab me by the arms. I turned to face my husband in desperation, clawing at me, hoping for some sign of mercy or understanding, but he just turned away, holding our son closer and protecting him from me as if I were a threat. As the officers led me to the car, I felt the full weight of what I'd done fall on my shoulders. The police station was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. They took my statement and asked questions that felt like needles pressing into an open wound, and all I could do was sit there numb as the reality of my choices crashed down. The betrayal had torn me apart, but in my rage, I tore apart everything I held dear. Now, as I sat in the back of the police car, I could only watch as my husband carried our son back inside, the door closing behind them with a finality that left me hollow. My husband testified, his words piercing me with each bitter accusation and detail of the betrayal he now wore openly, and I sat there helpless to defend myself, knowing that my actions had left the courtroom. Peace invested my heart and soul into a family I thought I was protecting, but in my blind rage, I destroyed it all. The trial was brutal, peeling back the layers of what I tried to hide every day. The court presented evidence of the men I'd hired, the plans I'd made, and every bitter, angry decision exposed under the harsh lights of the courtroom. My son's tiny arms wrapped around his father, his face hidden from me in fear, was all I could think about when the judge read the sentence. It haunted me and followed me into the sterile, empty cell where I now spent my days in silence, replaying the decisions that had led me here. I thought I was fighting for justice, dignity, and the love I felt I deserved, but all I'd done was destroy the life I'd once cherished, leaving nothing but a cold. I had nothing left, not even my family, my house, or the love I had taken for granted. All I had was the bitter memory of what I had done, which served as a constant reminder of the price I paid for allowing anger to take hold. As I sat by myself, the silence around me felt like the harshest punishment of all, because I had too much time to reflect, and it was in that unrelenting silence that I discovered the one truth that made my regret pierce deeper than anything else. I also received a letter from one of his friends a few days after the trial ended. This friend had sat in that courtroom and watched every painful detail of our life being dissected, exposing every one of my choices. The letter was written simply, in a calm, almost pitying tone that felt as cold as my prison cell. It was an odd thing to receive from someone I hardly knew, and my hands trembled as I opened it, wondering what else I could possibly say. However, as I read it, my heart fell, and I felt my world fall apart once more. He had contacted her to help him choose a gift for me because he wanted something special, something meaningful, something that would remind me of how much he still loved me despite the years, the work, and the quiet distance that had crept into our lives. According to the letter, they'd met that day to finalize the details of a custom locket he'd been seeing. The woman I'd convinced myself was his lover at the coffee shop had actually been his college friend. I felt sick, the room spinning as I clutched the letter, each word twisting in my heart like a dagger, and I let jealousy and anger blind me so completely that I destroyed the one person who had been trying to mend the broken pieces of our life. He had been planning to surprise me with it during our trip inside. He had planned to put a photo of our family, him, our son, and me together laughing as we once had. He thought that maybe seeing that image every day would remind me of everything we built, everything he still believed in. For days, I sat in my cell, consumed by this new unbearable grief, replaying every moment in my mind, every chance I'd had to stop to trust him to ask instead of accuse. I thought of our son, the fear in his eyes when I'd reached for him that day, the way he clung to his father, as if I were a stranger. He had betrayed me, and he loved me more deeply than I'd ever understood enough to fight for us when I'd already given up, and now, because of my choices, he would never look at me the same way again, if he looked at me at all. I'm sitting here by myself, wondering if I'll ever see my family again, if my husband will ever bring our son to see me, or even if there's even a chance to try to mend what I've broken. It's a reminder of everything I've lost in my quest to punish someone who had never done me wrong. I'm not sure how to ask for forgiveness from a man you've broken from, a son who might never trust you again. How do you live with yourself when the person you were trying to protect needed protection from you? I wonder if one day he will tell our son the truth about what I did and how his mother destroyed their family over a lie she told herself. I'm not sure how to move on, or even if it's possible, but I'm asking you, the readers who followed this painful story, who can see it from a distance without the blinding rage and jealousy that consumed me, what would you do? How do I live with this regret? How do I mend the relationship with a man I've deeply hurt? Child who deserved better, I never imagined that I would be the one seeking guidance on how to proceed, but here I am, asking if there is any way to make amends, to let them know that I understand what I did, and that I would take back what I did if I could. I don't expect forgiveness, knowing that I may never be worthy of it, but perhaps there is some small step I can take to begin mending what I've done. What would you do if you were me?